It's not sustainable for the US. It's not sustainable for anybody.
Speaking of which, so you do an amazing podcast called the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. So episode 108 of that podcast is about the very thing you just mentioned. And allow me, please, to read the description of that and then ask you a couple questions about your thoughts in general. The description reads, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. confiscated the Russian central bank's significant monetary reserves and banned some Russian banks from the SWIFT network. Serious questions are being asked about the survival of the post-war dollar-based world monetary order. Will Russia, China, and other countries actually build an alternative international settlement system after years of threatening to do so? Will global central banks stop accumulating U.S. Treasury bonds and replace them with gold and commodities? Will we witness the birth of a new commodity gold-based monetary order? In this seminar, we use the insights from the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard on temporal and spatial salability to explain why reports of the death of the dollar and the emergence of a new gold standard may be exaggerated. So I would love to get your analysis on this situation. Mm-hmm. What are the fundamentals of it? What is SWIFT? What are the possible future evolutions of the global monetary system?
Yeah, so SWIFT is the network that the U.S. Federal Reserve uses for moving money around the world. So basically, the U.S. government can sanction you off of SWIFT, as they've done with Russian banks, as they've done with Iran, and as they've done with Afghanistan. Effectively, I mean, this is really the catastrophe of the current monetary system, is that in order to be able to trade as a member, as a citizen of your country, you need your monopoly local central bank to be on good terms with the US government so that they would let them operate it. And this is really like on top of the aspect of the hardness of money. This is the other really powerful thing about Bitcoin, which is that it's just purely a technological thing. It doesn't matter if you're Russian, if you're Iranian, if you're American, if you're Chinese. It's a technology, and so it's like a spoon or a knife or a car. You know, you operate it properly and it works. And so with Bitcoin, it's the same thing. It doesn't care about your passport. If you have the private key, you click send, and the money goes. Well, it doesn't really go, but effectively it does go anywhere it wants, and the money can move without having to abide by political situations. And the point here is not to bash U.S. foreign policy, much as that might be deserved. I'm just going to discuss it from a kind of technical perspective. It has to be a political system with fiat, because ultimately it relies on credit, and then the government is the one that has the guns, and the government is going to decide who gets to pay their loans anyway, and the government's going to have to make its own rules about who gets to play and who doesn't. And so it has to be political as this kind of fiat system. And, you know, when I wrote the Bitcoin Standard, initially I used to be much more of a gold bug. And in my mind, you know, gold bugs have spent the last 50 years saying the global monetary system is going to collapse next week and we're going to go back to a gold standard. And writing the fiat standard gave me a very good appreciation for why this hasn't happened and why it's not very likely to happen. I think the reason is, as I said earlier, it's just gold is very expensive to move around, and perhaps more importantly, it's very expensive to verify. That's really the problem with it. It's very expensive to verify that the gold that you're receiving is original gold. So the only way to do this properly is to melt the gold bars down and recast them, which is pretty expensive. So we have this situation now where Russia, which is one of the biggest economies in the world, has been kicked off to varying degrees off the global monetary system, and the US has confiscated their reserves. And I don't have political opinions about the war. It's not something I'm very familiar with. It's outside of my area of expertise. I'm just analyzing the monetary aspects of it. It is, you know, on the one hand, whether you think the war is justified or the sanctions are justified is not something I can opine on. But the implication of this is that effectively the US might be shooting itself in the foot, because it's telling everybody in the world, your money in our system is not really your money. It's just a token to play in our arcade. And at any point in time, if you misbehave, we kick you out of the arcade and we take your tokens. And so, I mean, this is something that China, Russia, Iran, and many countries have made a lot of noise about over the past decades. It got real this year. But it's been decades of China, Iran, and Russia, to some extent, saying that, you know, we want to build an alternative to the US dollar-based system. And yet they haven't. And I think there's very good reasons they haven't. And the reason is, what do you do it based on? How do you build it? So you can do a credit-based system based on, but then who's going to be the big boss? Is it going to be China? Is it going to be Russia? Is it going to be Iran? Is it going to be India? None of these countries wants to be, they don't want to jump out of the US-based system to get into somebody else's based system. So China doesn't want to use a Russian system. Russia doesn't want to use a Chinese system. And so therefore you can't use their own central bank's currencies.
Don't you think they have enough leverage, India, China, Russia combined with several other nations have enough leverage and incentive to create their own system? So any one player, yes, but if they collaborate.
Yeah, but then, okay, so what do you base it on? Like, who's going to be the boss? Who's going to be the one who can...
In this case, China, right? Because China is becoming increasingly an economic power in the world.
Yeah.
That's hard to deny.
Yes, it's true. And it's the most likely scenario, perhaps, if we were to witness something like this, is going to be a Chinese-based system.
So is it possible to have a split in what is the driving currency of the world?
It's possible, but I don't think it's sustainable. Again, money wants to be one. And that's the kind of thing that I argue in that seminar. So we could see this emerge based around the yuan. And, likely, Russia is obviously going to hurt economically from what happened, from the confiscation of the reserves and from the sanctions. So it's not going to be in a position, and of course, because it's outside of the US-based system, it's not in the strongest negotiating position with the Chinese, so the Chinese might be able to get them to join their yuan-based system. But I don't think that's sustainable in the long run, because these governments can issue their laws and make their designs and then make their monetary systems, but ultimately, there are billions of Chinese people and billions of dollar-based people, and they're going to want to trade with one another. And the power to want to trade with one another is too strong. Like, we can't just split the world economy into two monetary systems that don't trade with one another. So then they're going to want to trade with one another.
Or the dark possibility is the inability to trade, as opposed to being a forcing function for trade, it become a forcing function for conflict in cyberspace and potentially hot war.
Yes, this is the scary part of it. And this is basically how World War II happened, because there's an old historian who used to say when, I think his name is Otto Mallory, and I quote him in the Bitcoin Standard, if goods don't cross borders, then bombs will. If people trade with one another, they have an incentive for each other's well-being, and then they have less of an incentive to fight. And it was the death of global trade in the 1930s because of the failure of the fiat system that brought about the rise of the populism and the rise of all those leaders that hated each other and helped finance the war and bring it about. So that is the scary possibility. And of course, you can't discount that with all of the escalation that you see. That is a possibility that it could turn into a real war. But then, even so, I think ultimately you can't fight wars forever. It's going to end at some point, and we're going to be back at square one, or well, not square one. We're going to be back at the same dilemma of who's going to have the global monetary system. And so one alternative is that what the Chinese and the Russians could do is they could base it on a commodity. So a lot of people are now saying, well, they're going to base it on copper and corn and agricultural commodities. And that's the analysis of saleability that we discuss in the Bitcoin Standard and the fiat standard. I don't think that's workable. If you end up basing the monetary system on copper, as we said earlier, doesn't matter how many governments say that we're going to make a new monetary system based on copper, grains, and nickel and iron and so on, doesn't matter. You're just going to stockpile. You're going to have to stockpile those things in order to make a market in them. And then if you stockpile those things, you're just raising their value, inviting the producers to make more, flood the market. I hope they don't try this, because it's going to be a devastating impact on the world economy. You're going to have central banks bidding up the price of essential commodities that people need for real uses in order to back their currencies with them, and then just incentivizing the producers to make more and more and more of it, and then bringing the price back down. So it's going to be a very expensive mistake where we raise the price of copper, destroy a lot of industries dependent on copper, and it's not just copper, but also food, and then increase the supply beyond what we need. And the end result is copper miners make out well, governments go broke, and we end up with a lot of rusting copper in government warehouses. That's why I don't think it works for the to use commodities that are not monetary commodities. Then the question is maybe gold. Can we go back on another gold standard? And I mean, Russia seems to have done that. I'm not so sure. It's very difficult to get reliable information. I'm trying to look into this more. But they seem to have said that they're fixing the price of gold in rubles. So they will buy and sell gold at a fixed ruble rate, which effectively means you're on a gold standard. Now, I'm not sure how serious this is, how they've managed to stick to it, but it seems to have stabilized the ruble and in fact brought it back to its pre-war level, which I found absolutely astonishing, considering all the sanctions going on. But in the short run, it's obviously much better than having your currency pegged to nothing. But in the long run, I also don't think gold is going to cut it in the 21st century.
Do you think there's any chance they go full gangster move and go into the digital space on the blockchain, go with Bitcoin?
I think, the point of this discussion is that, we run through all these other options, a Chinese-based system, why it probably won't work, a commodity-based system, why it won't work, and a gold-based system, why it won't work. I think they might have to learn this the wrong way, the hard way. But eventually, I don't see them doing it now, but eventually I think the winning move is going to be to go on a Bitcoin-based monetary system.
Well, I don't know if everything always has to be the hard way.
I'd love it not to be, but I mean, it doesn't look like there is any kind of desire in China or in Russia to switch to a Bitcoin-based system.
Leap to Bitcoin.
So unfortunately, I think we're going to go through a few years, maybe many years of learning the lesson the hard way, of trying to accumulate these commodities and seeing the limitations that make them unsuitable as money today.
Well, one of the things I'm really concerned about is the tension, the increasing amount of hate in the world.
Yes.
And the increasing amount of power centers in the world, between which hate is making a regular appearance, and because the weapons of war are becoming more and more powerful as they have been in the past many decades, I'm really concerned about nuclear war. So let us see if Bitcoin can fix this.
Yes, Bitcoin fixes all of this. The first rule of Bitcoin is, if it's a problem, Bitcoin fixes it.
All right, well, I have some personal questions for Bitcoin then, because I have my life is pretty fucked up, so I'll have to try to see.